Hello all my JavaScript friends, this is TheVirtuoid, aka Mike Smith, and this is our RPG game. Our first video here is the dice. We're going to be learning how to roll dice. Now generally what we're going to do here is that as we go through each one of the different sections of the basic fantasy role-playing game, and again the link is in the description, make sure you click on it, we're going to be producing three different documents. We're going to be producing a design document, a unit test document, and the actual code itself. And normally I'm going when we go over all these things, just for lack of time, we're going to basically skim over the design, skim over the test, and just kind of dive more deep into how the coding actually works. But for the dice one, I figured let's take it a little bit slower and a little bit more in detail to show you the process that I use to be able to get everything working. So the first thing I always do is I always produce a design document. And what I call it, let me expand that out here a little bit and highlight that. I call it whatever the name of the class is, .design.md. And it's a markdown file because that's obviously what MD stands for. And from there, I define exactly what I want to do with the dice class. So let's just bring the whole dice class up. So basically, allow for the rolling of the dice. I'm going to have some sort of constructor here. This is basically, you can create a new dice. The big thing here is going to be the descriptor. And that descriptor is something that says, what kind of dice do you want to throw? And this is following the normal nomenclature that people have used, or the normal formula that people have used in the past for being able to describe how to roll dice. So not only going to have a constructor for the dice, I'm also going to have a method called roll, which will basically roll the dice. And you can either roll with a new descriptor or roll a descriptor you already had. For example, if you wanted to roll 3 6-sided dice, which is very, very standard within role-playing games, you could create a new class called new dice with a 3 dice 6 descriptor, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And then you could just keep calling roll, 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 roll to be able to get all your different values. You can also pass a new descriptor to it if you just want to roll a single one. If you don't want to instantiate a particular instance of the dice, I'm also going to give you the ability to roll based upon a static method. So you can just say dice.roll. And static methods are basically methods that don't require an instantiation. So for example, a very good one is if you use the number class, you could say number.isInteger. And that is a method, or that is a static method on the number that allows you to test to see if another number is an integer or not. The same thing I'm going to do here. I'm going to be able to say dice.roll. In fact, you can see some examples down here. I can either just say dice.roll and roll in this case, a 3d6, which is 3 dice 6. I can instantiate it and just continue to call roll, or I can instantiate it and then also use that same instantiation to roll a new dice. But the real key here is this descriptor format. That's the most important part of this whole deal. And what we're doing here is we're doing the way that I learned how many years ago, and I think it appears is still in use today, is basically what we call the XDY method. The XDY method basically says that the letter X represents the number of dice that you're going to roll, and that's optional. If you don't have that in there, it defaults to 1. The letter D itself, the physical letter D, and in my case, I'm going to give you both the uppercase and the lowercase d, and then the Y, which happens to be the number of sides on the dice. So I have required, in fact, it's always required that you have at least the letter D and the number of sides for the dice. So, 1d6 will give you a one 6-sided die. 2d8 will give you 2 8-sided die. 3D100 will give you 3 100-sided die, and D6 will give you 1 D-sided die. One 6-sided die. Other invalid examples, this one happens to be missing the number of sides that's required. This one has a 1D1. You cannot have a one-sided die. That's stupid. You don't want that. You cannot have a negative number as a number of sides here. You cannot have a non-integer as the number of sides. And you cannot have a non-integer as the number of dice itself. Both numbers must be integers. So the idea here now is that we're going to be able to simulate all of this based upon the classes. And then we're going to test it. That's the second thing I do is I create a unit test. Now I will admit here, and I'm going to have a video. I haven't created it yet, but I will have a video and hopefully be up before I produce this video here of when I use AI and when I do not. This is one of the times where I do use AI. One of the things I have discovered is AI is very good at helping me flesh out ideas. If I got some very complicated ideas that I'm working through, and I've been working through some very complicated ideas both here and in my Pay the Mortgage job. I've also discovered that AI is good, not very good, but good at doing unit tests. And in fact, because of how simple this design is, it actually did an extremely good job on this unit test here. One of the things that UI is not very good on is still producing actual working code. So, you got to be careful. But the idea here is I did use UI to, I told it that, hey, take this dicedesign.md and give me a series of unit tests that will test all that. And it came up with this, and it was actually really, really good. There is a couple of mistakes, so I always want to encourage you that when you do use UI, always check its work. Just don't take it verbatim. And I went through every single one of these to make sure this is exactly what I wanted these tests to encounter. And these tests are all correct. Now, the big thing here also that I did notice was this section down here. And this is where I kept it in here purposely to show you, that UI can make mistakes. So for example, it says here, throws when the descriptor is undefined. So basically when I'm doing the static one, you've got to have some sort of descriptor or else it doesn't know what to do. So I'm going to throw if the descriptor is null, and I'm going to throw if the descriptor is undefined. Well, the thing is that if you do not have an argument, it automatically is undefined. So this particular portion is completely and totally meaningless. But the rest of this is okay, because one of the things I do want to check for is to make absolutely certain that what we are passing is a string. So I am passing one test here to say, hey, I'm passing a null. Make sure you throw. I could also put a Boolean in there, a number in there, an object in there, an array in there, and all that kind of fun stuff. But I thought just one should be example enough. But other than that, it worked very, very well, especially all of this down here where I have all the different valid descriptors and all the different invalid descriptors. I added a few more of these once unit tests created this. It was missing a few of the valid and invalid ones, so I added just a few extra ones in there to make sure I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. And so that's the unit test. Like I said, AI generated this for me, and it did a very good job, but I checked every single one of it, and I encourage you to do the same thing. Don't use AI as a crutch, okay? Anyway, I'd said all that through gritted teeth. I hope you figured that part out. So let's actually run the unit test as we currently have it. So let's go back over to our screen. Here is our screen, and that's what we're going to run for the unit test. And I'm using VTest for this example. I've used Cypress and all the rest of my unit tests, but I'm using VTest here because I'm not having any kind of UI, and Cypress could also do UI. VTest could also do UI, but it works better for this kind of command line work that we're doing. So we do that one, and we got, oh wow, it looks like I got a whole bunch of errors. Well, we got 35 errors out of 53 tests. Really? What happened there? Oh, it actually worked on some of them. Look at that, and look at that. How did it work on all of these? Well, notice every single one of these says throw. So because, let's flip back over to the code. If I go to my actual code, there's absolutely nothing there. So since I had to throw, because there's nothing there, those tests actually worked. So those are kind of phantom unit tests. And that, again, is something you need to check out for. And if I was really doing this correctly, I would actually now do the unit test to make sure that we had the correct instantiation before I threw any kind of errors. But hey, that's just the way it is in this particular case. So let's go ahead and we take a look at the dice. And if we take a look at the design, the most important thing we have here is we got to figure out some way to be able to parse out this information. So I can tell you right now, one of the things we're going to need is some sort of a way to parse it. Like I said, some sort of way to parse it out. I also, since we're going to have a dice roll as a static method and a roll as a method itself, it needs to be common for both of these. So I'm going to make this into a static method that is going to be a private static method. So let's go over to the dice and let's pop that in there. And through the magic of television, it's all ready to go. So the idea here now is that we have a parse descriptor that will allow me to parse out the descriptor and make sure that we've covered all of our different options here. So for example, one of the things is if type of descriptor is not a string, then we throw an error. That's going to take care of the problem where we don't have a string. If the descriptor is completely blank, the descriptor can't be empty, so that throws an error. Here's an interesting thing here, descriptor parts. I split for the letter D because remember the D is required. So I've passed a regex here, a regular expression to basically say, I want you to split this string up into its component parts using D as a delimiter. Now, either the lowercase d or the uppercase d. That's what that regex actually does. So what will happen is this should split this into two different parts, the number on the left-hand side of the D and the number on the right-hand side of the D. So the first thing I want to do here is that if the length does not equal 2, that means one of two things. Either we don't have any D's inside there or we have more than one D inside of there. So if the length of the descriptor parts must equal 2. Descriptor number 0 is going to be your number of dice. Descriptor number at index number 1 is going to be the sides. So if it doesn't equal 2, then we want to throw an error saying the descriptor must be x, dy. If the descriptor of 0 is a empty string, not even an empty string, a completely empty string, then we force it to be 1. Now, why are we doing that? The reason we're doing that is that if we pass, let's go to the design document here. If we don't pass a number at the very beginning, we assume that the number is going to be a 1. So a D6 means basically a 1D is exactly the same thing as a 1D6. When you do a split inside JavaScript, and that delimiter happens to be the very first character, like it is in this particular case, then it's still going to split it into two different parts, but that first part is going to be a completely empty string. And so I'm testing for this empty string here to make sure that we have the number 1 inside there. So now we know we have a number of dice and number of sides. We convert those to numbers, and then we test to make sure both of them are integers, because remember, we can't have non-integers there. So if I'm using the number.isInteger static method to find out if the number of dice is correct, or to find out if the number of sides is correct. So all those are correct. Also, I'm checking the number of sides is less than 2, because the fact of the matter is we now know they're integers, but it could be a negative number, or it could be the number 0, or it could be the number 1. We don't want that. We want 2 or more. You can't have a negative-sided die or a one-sided die or even a zero-sided die. So if the number of sides is less than 2, we're going to throw an error upon that, and then return the number of dice and the number of sides. So if we save all of that and now go back to our test screen, we still have 35 failures. Now, why is that? Well, that's very, very easy to understand, because all we've done here is just put in a parse descriptor. We don't have anything in there to be able to tell us that the parse descriptor is being called. There's no constructors, no nothing. So let's go back over to our screen, and what we're going to work on here is the constructor. So we have a bunch of things on the constructor, a bunch of tests. Creates an instance with no descriptor, creates an instance with a valid descriptor, throws, and all that kind of fun stuff. So let's create our constructor that will satisfy all those different tests. So pardon me, and I'll be back shortly. And through the magic of television, we're ready to go. So first of all, descriptor defaults to null, because if there's a null descriptor, I want to be able to go back to our design here. So some of the good examples, I want to be able to sit there and say, here we go. I want to be able to sit there and say random dice, new dice, but then pass a descriptor into the role. So if it does not equal null, then I want to be able to parse the descriptor. So now this is where we parse the descriptor. So we get back to number of sides and the number of dice. And we save those off into private variables. And as you can tell here, I've created 3 private variables: the descriptor, the number of sides, and number of dice. Now, I don't care right now for the number of sides and the number of dice. All I care about is the descriptors, because that was what was in the design. So I've set a getter function for the descriptor. This makes the descriptor to be read only, and it hides this number of sides and the number of dice. Later on, as we start working with this thing, I may want to be able to expose number of sides and number of dice. In that case, I will have getter functions for those too. But that's basically all there really is to it. If it does equal no, we just pass the descriptor on in. And that's pretty much all there is. So if we save it, and now we go over to our screen, and by the way, for vtest here, every time we save it, it automatically runs the test. So now now you can tell now we only have 24 failures at the top here, because now all of our constructors are very good. In fact, even our public properties are good now, because we only have one public property, the descriptor. That's it. Descriptor returns no, and no descriptor was provided for the constructor. That's where the null came from. The value is passed, and the descriptor is read only. So I have tests for all of those. So now the idea here is we want to do the dice roll itself. So let's take a look at that. As you can tell here, for some reason, the dice roll is still throwing. And the reason it's throwing is because dice roll itself does not exist. So the actual error that we're getting here is that the dice roll does not exist. And in reality, this is a problem with my dice test. What I should be doing here, let me flip back over to the code. What I should be here is this saying to throw. I need to have it to throw a certain error. And by doing that, my test is a little bit better. So that's one of the things I kind of want to warn. That's one of the things I want to warn you about here. I just went with just a to throw, just for simplicity's sake. But if you want to be really perfect about it, then you want to be able to check that a certain error has been thrown. Well, we're not here. So just to count, let's go back over to our screen, and we have 24 failures. Watch what happens if I add the static roll. And I'll just write it up here. Descriptor. And we just make it blank and nothing else. Now we're up to 32 failures, because now that it's blank, all those throws that were okay because it was actually throwing another error now throws errors because, you know, oh, we got the static roll, but we're now throwing an error. So let's see what we can do with it. Well, the first thing we need to do with the roll, let's get back to the code. So the first thing we need to do with the roll is we're going to need to be able to parse out the information. So let's type all that in. And through the magic of television, it has now been typed in. So we get number of dice and number of sides on the parse descriptor. We're now parsing the descriptor that we pass in. So that's why we had the parse descriptor on its own little routine here, is that now we could just do the roll here and just say, hey, you know, let's parse out that descriptor. So if we save it and go back to our unit test, ta-da! Well, our throws are now back good, and they're back good because they're actually throwing the correct one. So we're back down to 16 failures. So now what we need to do, well, none of these are coming up correctly, so we now need to be able to roll the dice themselves. So we got a couple of little things we can do here. We can either roll the dice within the roll section here, but that won't quite work very well. One of the things you want to do with JavaScript is basically have one function do one thing. Roll here, I'm going to do a parse descriptor, and then I'm going to have code in there that will have to actually roll the dice. But what if I have another method somewhere along the line that may also need to roll the dice? And then a third method that may need to roll the dice, and a fourth method that may need to roll the dice. Well, then, you know, we're up a creek if we have to continue to call the static method roll to be able to get that parse descriptor. So this is, or basically have to duplicate the roll in this particular case. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a roll. We're going to create a roll the dice. We'll call it roll the dice method, or static method here, that will physically roll the dice based upon the number of sides and the number of dice. So hold a minute, please. And through the magic of television, we have that. So here's our roll the dice. All we have to do is pass the number of dice and the number of sides. And it's just a very simple little for next loop to be able to roll everything, you know, to roll the dice, basically. That's it. It just returns the sum. So now the roll will, first of all, get the descriptor, and if it doesn't throw an error or anything like that, it then returns the roll the dice. And so now we should be able to say dice.roll, give it a descriptor, and get the numbers. And if we flip over to our unit test, By golly gee, we do. We're only down to 6 failures. We started with, what, 34? Now we're down to 6 because now all of our dice rolls work. What else have we got? Oh, check it out. I forgot about this, the descriptor format. Yeah, look at this. Look at this. Look at that test. 1D, I don't know what that number is, but it's a valid number. It's actually that is actually the maximum safe integer number in JavaScript. But that is a valid number of sides. Can you imagine having a dice with that many sides? I don't know what that number is, and I'm not sure if I'm going to take a look at it. But anyway, now we need to take a look at this. It's throwing these 2 error messages because we do not have a roll method. So let's go back over to our code, and I'll show you what happens when we create a roll method itself. And I'm just going to type this in, and that's all we're going to put in there. It's just something real simple. And once we do that, if we flip back over to our screen, just like with the static roll, this roll now throws, instead of saying, oh, those 2 are great, now it then says, no, those 2 are wrong because nothing is being thrown when we do the descriptor. So now basically what I want to do here now is we want to be able to do 2 things. If we don't pass a descriptor on the roll, we want to use whatever descriptor we have had before. But if we do pass a descriptor, we want to use that descriptor. So if we pass the descriptor to the roll, we need to parse out the descriptor, and then we need to roll the dice. But if we have already passed the descriptor to the roll, then we don't want to do that. We want to go ahead and just figure out what we needed to do or just roll the dice, and that's it. So if you'll hold on for one moment, let's put that code in there. And through the magic of television, we are here. So the idea here now is that we're going to pass a descriptor that will default to our current descriptor. Our current descriptor is either going to be null or it's going to be an actual descriptor. So what I do is I check if I have set the number of dice and I have set the number of sides and the 2 descriptors match, which means they will match automatically if I don't pass a descriptor, then I'm just going to roll the dice based upon what I already have. That's it. There is nothing else, because remember, when we did the constructor up here, if we pass a new descriptor, we save off the number of sides and the number of dice. So those are available to us automatically. Since those are already available to us, we just roll the dice and we're done. However, if we don't have this, or we don't have that, or the descriptor does not equal this descriptor, which means that we may have done a descriptor beforehand, but now we got a new descriptor, then we're just going to return the static method, because the static method does everything we need it to do. The static method does the parse the descriptor and does the roll the dice for us. So this gets around the issue to where if we already have a number of sides and a number of dice, we just need to roll the dice and nothing else. And once we do that, then we're fine. We don't have to parse the descriptor each and every single time. So let's take a look at, let's save it, and let's take a look at our unit test. And oh, look at this. Everything is green. There are no failures. There it is. Test file 1 has passed. 53 tests has passed. Took 33 milliseconds. But now everything completely passes. So now we are able to come back into here and say without a doubt that at least these particular valid ones are all completely valid or invalid, that we can now pass a dice formula or a dice equation to any way we want to put it using the X, D, Y format. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to this channel to view more videos. Click on the like button on this video and visit us at TheVirtuoid.com. Also, support us on Patreon, where you can get access to member-only videos. Links are down below. Again, thank you very much for watching, and keep on coding.